Okay, guys, this is your fourth lecture on World War II. This is going to be focusing on the turning points of the war and American entry into the war in Europe. So, in lecture 3, we had left off with the American impact on the home front, and so now turning our attention to the war in Europe. First up is the Battle of the Atlantic. One of the first things that the United States had to do as they entered into the war was start sending supplies to the Allied powers in Europe, particularly Great Britain and then to the Soviet Union. But this is going to be proven to be very difficult because of the German U-boats. Hitler wanted at all costs to try to prevent American supplies from getting to Europe, particularly the Great Britain. He knew Great Britain was in desperate need of supplies, and so if he could keep American supplies from reaching Great Britain, it may force Great Britain into submission and eventually to surrender. So getting supplies proved to be very difficult. The German U-boats hunted in what was called wolf packs, okay, primarily of U-boats. And after 6 months after Pearl Harbor, so June of 1942, they had sunk about 650 Allied ships. So Hitler was proving to be a very good defensive force within the Atlantic. So the Allies had to try to change their tactics. They start sending their ships in convoys. So they have their merchant ships in the center surrounded by naval destroyers. The naval destroyers had sonar so they could detect the U-boats underwater before they got close for able to attack. They also sent air patrols to fly ahead over the sea to be able to look for the U-boats that may be above water and try to bomb them and eliminate them as a threat. Victory was very nerve-wrackingly narrow. They eventually are going to be able to get supplies and, of course, eventually American troops, but it was always a tight war within the Atlantic. And we were lucky that the war ended when it did, because Hitler was mass-producing some newer, better subs that the United States and even Great Britain, the greatest navy in the world, may not have been able to combat against. And so this is a picture of some of those naval attacks that were taking place in the Atlantic. The major turning point on the Eastern Front, so between Germany and the Soviet Union, is the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler wanted the city of Stalingrad because of its access close to the oil fields. Plus, Stalingrad was a major industrial city. And it was also, of course, Stalin's namesake. So just trying to rub a little salt in the wound, wanting to be able to capture that city. So Hitler sends the advance, okay? But this is going to be the first time that the German army is going to be stopped by the Soviet army. But it's not going to be immediate victory. So the German army went in spring of 1942. But unfortunately, as they went into the spring, it turned into summer and then fall and winter. Essentially, the Soviets kind of surrounded and barricaded the German soldiers within the city of Stalingrad and were trying to force them to starve out and to freeze out. Many of the German soldiers were in summer uniforms, light linen. They were not prepared for the harshness of the Russian winters, and so many began to starve to death, freeze to death. They were eating their horses. They started to restrict the amount of food. Only those who were able to fight were going to be able to get food in Stalingrad. Eventually, it will force the Germans to surrender and to retreat. And so this is sometimes considered to be the most important battle of the war, because this is where things start to turn around for the Allies. They're not just on the defensive and barely hanging on. Even though the Soviet Union was desperate for supplies, in the Battle of Stalingrad, they sent their troops out in partners. One had the bullets, one had the gun. Whoever died first, you took from the other. That was how Stalin fought the war. To be able to replenish his troops with his growing abundance and population. So this is going to be the first major Nazi defeat on land, and the German army from this point on the Eastern Front is going to be on retreat until they reach Berlin, and the Russians will occupy Berlin in spring of 1945. So among the other allies, as Stalin is combating against Germany on the Eastern Front and starting to take the offensive, is now looking for action from Great Britain and the United States. As we know, Stalin wanted them to actually invade France to try to force some pressure off of the Soviet troops in the East and force Hitler to split his troops between an attack in the East and an attack in the West. But France was so heavily fortified that it would have slaughtered American and British troops. So instead, Churchill and Roosevelt decided to go with Operation Torch. They decided to go in from northern Africa. They had an early victory at the Battle of El Alamein, which was in Egypt. This is where Hitler, desperate need of oil, wasn't being successful in the Soviet Union of obtaining oil, so he went after the oil in the Middle East. Battle of El Alamein was significant because if the Germans had won, they would have gotten control of the Suez Canal. So that was a decisive victory in the summer of 1942, which began the launching point for the North African campaign. This is where Dwight Eisenhower is going to make a name for himself and his success in Northern Africa. He's going to be pulled to start planning what will become the D-Day invasion and the invasion into Normandy, France. Pictured here, we've got FDR and Churchill sitting. This is at the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943. Stalin wasn't there because, of course, he was in the grips of the battle with Stalingrad. He was holding on and hoping to make that change in advance in February of 43, so he did not attend that meeting. But this is where FDR and Churchill decide to really start talking about the terms that they expect from the Axis powers to end the war. And one of the key terms is they required unconditional surrender. So they wanted to ensure that there would be no further conflict. They also decided to postpone the attack on France, and instead of going immediately for France because it really needed to be a detailed planned attack, they decided to invade Sicily. Since they had control of northern Africa, they could easily sail across the Mediterranean to hit the island of Sicily and then hopefully get into mainland Italy. So they will start planning the cross-channel invasion, which is set for 1944, and they will continue to step up their efforts in the Battle of the Atlantic. Looking at Italy, so in July of 1943, after their success in Northern Africa, Patton is going to be the replacement for Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he leads the Third Army in a naval attack to capture the island of Sicily. They were victorious within a month, and the Italian people were tired and weary of war. We haven't talked much about Italy in regards to the war, and the reason is Mussolini wasn't quite as ruthless or cutthroat as Hitler would like. So Hitler actually invaded Italy and took over and stationed German troops there, which angered the Italian people because that is not what they signed up for. So Mussolini is going to be forced out of power by members of the fascist party. The king himself actually strips Mussolini of all of his rights and powers and tells him he needs to leave and says essentially, you're the most unpopular man in the country of Italy. So Mussolini is going to be on the run. 2 years after he is stripped of all powers, he was apprehended dressed as a Nazi soldier trying to get into German territory, where he will eventually be lynched along with his mistress. And then he and his mistress' bodies are going to be put on display in the city square of Milan, that the people threw stones and trash at. This is going to instill fear in Hitler, which is one of the reasons why Hitler takes his own life instead of being apprehended. A couple of short months after the capture of Sicily in October of 1943 is when Italy declares war on Germany. So the Italian citizens start to change sides. They try to support the Allied powers to try to push Germany out. But Hitler refuses to give up. He sends reinforcements and tries to hold on to Rome. So it's going to be a long, drawn-out, bloody movement. By June of 1944, significant date there, as we'll see when we come close to the invasion of Normandy, France, known as D-Day, but Rome will finally be taken. And so this is considered the turning point in the southern front, as the Third Army is moving up from the south, trying to march closer to Germany. But that march is going to be slow, and it is going to be very bloody and very tumultuous as they try to get into German territory. Of course, by May 2nd, 1945, the Third Army will reach Berlin. It was 5 days before surrender, and this is when many of the German troops at that time in the southern region laid down their arms and became prisoners of war. Pictured here is one of the last meetings between Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, the Tehran Conference in 1943, and this is where they plan the attack for D-Day. So they explain the plans to Stalin. Stalin is pleased because now it will force Hitler to split his troops on two fighting fronts. This is also, more importantly, where they established the terms for United Nations. And so all countries, all three, agree to become equal members in regards to the establishment of the UN. The D-Day invasion, so June 6, 1944. This is where Dwight D. Eisenhower planned Operation Overlord. It was the largest invasion force at that time in history. So the D-Day invasion was for many of the young men ages 18 to 25 was the most difficult experience that they had ever gone through, trying to storm the beaches. They tried to send out false intelligence to the German patrols, hoping they would pick up the messages and heavily fortify the beaches that they weren't storming, but they still encountered a great deal of German firepower. They sent reinforcements. They tried to block the German reinforcements by crippling the railroads, by trying to bomb them, but even the paratroopers, like the 101st Airborne, one of the best known divisions used at the D-Day invasion, those paratroopers, they got dropped in the wrong spot. So our reinforcements to try to help attack the Germans from behind on the beaches are going to have to try to double back to their destinations to try to help those troops who are trying to storm the beaches. So it was extremely difficult, but they were able to capture those beachheads, and this is going to be their entrance into France and on their way march to Germany. So the next lecture is going to be focusing on the end of the war in Europe.